I'm Josh. Welcome back to my channel today. I wanted to talk to you about my favorite time travel books, or my so-called favorites. I don't know, maybe you've seen this video. I made a time travel video list of like just 10 time travel book recommendations. It was one of the earliest videos I made on my channel when I started back in January of 2019. It has since become my biggest viewed video of all time. It has nearly 6,000 views. I'm excited that it got so much responses, but at the same time, as I reflect, I kind of cringe at some of the recommendations I made because I've wanted to return to a lot of these, and some of them I have, which I'll talk about. But many of them that I returned to for the first time in 2, 3, even 4 more years, I really kind of wish I hadn't recommended them because there were some major flaws that I did not see that I have since come to notice. I think partly because I can see how my reading has changed, the way in which I read has changed, and the intent behind how I read has changed. And I want to talk about that. But first, I just want to talk about my list in general. So this isn't going to be just negative. I want to talk about all the books that I've reread once or twice or even multiple times since I made that video. And I want to start positive. I want to start with the 2 books that are my favorite time travel books of all time. In fact, they're my favorite books of all time. And that is, of course, Kindred by Octavia Butler, Middle Game by Shauna McGuire. Whenever I'm asked, what's your favorite book of all time? It's always these 2 that I come to. I can't pick between them because they're very different books, but they're 2 examples of how time travel is being used in such a magnificent way. Let us begin with Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is the story of a young woman named Dana who lives in the 1970s, which at the time was present day, and she gets thrust back in time to the antebellum South, where she finds this young boy named Rufus, who was a white redhead kid who was in trouble and needs saving. She saves him and returns back to her time. This becomes a cycle of returning to Rufus in need as he gets older, each time staying longer than before, and her trying to both survive and make it back home. And in doing so, we get 2 things. We get a very compelling science fiction narrative and a very reflective and insightful book on a range of things, from just racism to slavery to bigotry, privilege, and a range of different things that aren't coming to mind. And it's all very starkly looked at in this book. It's not an easy book to read from an emotional standpoint, but I think it's the perfect example of what is possible when you're using the time travel genre. It opens doors to very unique perspectives that, when done well, can really, really bring a book to brand new heights, which is why I think this book just pops out above all the rest, or most of the rest at least. And if you haven't read this, obviously recommend it. It's not just a very insightful book, it's a very fast-paced book, I think, from my perspective. I actually struggled going from this book to Octavia Butler's other book, Parable the Sower, because it was slower. I have since changed my feelings on that. I love both, but point is that fantastic book, a very good example of what is possible with time travel. Moving on to Middle Game, I think is another example of how, when done right, time travel can just be a really good form of storytelling. And I say that from a different perspective now, because this isn't really looking at major themes like in Kindred. Instead, it's taking a plot device, and I think it's using it to construct a very well put together narrative that is just a very compelling science fiction story. This follows 2 people, Roger and Dodger, siblings, twins, who were made from these alchemists who were trying to harness the energy of the universe. And basically in this endeavor, they're using these 2 as the way of which to harness the power. And the bulk of the story basically is following them as they're growing into adulthood and eventually find each other. But the overarching narrative is this clashing, this coming together of them, and this inevitable, almost doomsday that is triggering this recycling, this sort of repeat of undoing things that we as readers and Roger and Dodger are all trying to understand as the story progresses. This may seem like a major spoiler, but I don't think it is, because the book opens at the end of the book. Basically, blood everywhere. I just tell you, I love the opening. There was so much blood. Roger didn't know there was this much blood in the human body. It seems impossible, ridiculous, prolificate, waste of something that should be precious and rare. It just gets right in there and gets into it. And I love this book, and for many reasons that I think a lot of people disliked it, because it's almost convoluted in nature, the way in which it all comes together. I love Shauna Maguire's talent and her ability to construct a very compelling narrative. And at the core of it, though, the crux of it, are two very compelling sibling characters. And I have siblings of my own, and so I could feel that connection there. And it's that familiar connection that really just roots me into the story in a way that I think makes it just exceed above all the others, and is why it is up there as one of my favorite books of all time, both time travel and in general. Moving on now to two of the books that I really enjoy for different or similar reasons, but not necessarily as highly. I've talked about this enough. 11/22/63. It is just a fun book. It takes Stephen King's ability to write a pretty compelling narrative, and it uses time travel, which I love. And at the core of it, we have characters that I absolutely adore and feel connected to. Stephen King, if he can do anything right, it's make very compelling characters, or characters you feel very strongly about, either positively or negative. And while it's overbloated, it's one that I love reading and love returning to. It's one that has not died away in my love. And I think it also helps that it was more recently written, so it saved many of the young problematic aspects of Stephen King's writings. Even though that is the case, I still feel like it has the feel of a classic Stephen King. Another Shauna Maguire here, and this one here, Beneath the Sugar Sky, isn't, we shouldn't have been on that video just because it's not a major time travel book. It's just a book in the Wayward Children series. But the reason I love this book, and I still love it, is because time travel is supposed to have, needs to have, very definitive rules to work with. Shauna Maguire did the literal opposite, and it worked really well, in my opinion. A world of nonsense where nothing makes sense, and somehow she pulled it off in my book. Maybe it's because I'm in love with Shauna Maguire and everything she does is amazing, but an example of doing the opposite of what I want and it somehow being exactly what I want. Now moving on to the books that I ended up rereading. I've been moving, hence the new background, and in that move I wanted some comfort reads, but I also just had more time in general to listen to books, and so I did just that. Where did I start? I think I started with Gloria O'Brien's History of the Future. This isn't a bad take. This is a very good take. I read this for the first time in December of 2019, so it's been 2 years, and it was really good then. This is a story about a young girl who, with her friend, eats a petrified bat and gets the ability to see into the future and into the past. Basically, she looks into a person's eyes and she can see their distant future or their distant past, including that of their relatives or descendants. It's a fun book that I think uses quote-unquote time travel fairly well, and it does so in a way that it just I thought was really fun to read. But it's also like introspective. It's trying to both look at this young girl as she's coming of age, trying to understand herself. There's that perspective to admire. But there's also a dystopian aspect where, because she's seeing the future, she's seeing the world in a very dark place, a world where women have lost their rights, where the U.S. is in civil war. And I was reading this literally the week in which it was being announced that the Supreme Court was actively discussing overturning Roe versus Wade. Not just discussing it, but seriously talking as if it was a viable option. And this is also coming almost a year after the insurrection at the Capitol. And this book, even though it was written in 2014, just feels so very prescient in a way that is unsettling, but also just very moving, because of just, as absurdist as it may seem, it honestly, I think, does an unreal job at sort of predicting the future, or the possible future. I read some reviews that were saying that the future was just unrealistic. It was too over the top or something. I'm like, it really isn't that out of reach. I think you're naive if you think it is, personally. So this one was a fun reread, and I think it stands up on my list of recommendations. Now on to the books that don't stand up. Actually, that's not true. There's one more book that I didn't want to pull out, which is right there. The First 15 Lies of Harry August. It's like underneath a bunch of other books, so I didn't want to pull it out. But this book here is a Groundhog's Day book. Harry August lives his life, and then he dies, and he wakes up in his younger self, meaning he relives his entire life as a baby and onward. The book's like split into 2 parts. I think the first part being just exploring what this would be like, and the second part being this greater conflict. The greater conflict being the world is ending, and it's happening sooner in every life. And it may be that Harry August is playing a role in that. And I love this book for a few reasons that I think I've already touched on in many ways. First off, I felt like the structuring of it was really well done. I thought the use of the plot device of time travel was just well executed. It used it as a way to discuss what it would be like to really explore this idea of what it would be like to wake up in your younger self, to relive your life in a way that felt very real. Keep that in mind, because there's another book that has a Groundhog narrative that I think does it very poorly. I think it does it in a way that is all too easily believable, in a way that really helps you get lost into the story, in this fantastical, speculative story. On top of all that, the way in which she tells a story, even though it's overall linear in nature and how she tells a story, it is done in a way that isn't afraid to venture off into side narratives, side points from different parts of his lives in a way that makes it feel almost non-linear, even though it is pretty much linear. But that non-linear aspect to it, the way we can break free of this perspective, I think was really freeing and gave us like a really unique perspective on his overarching lives and how they all came together. And the book also explores the nature of, I guess, scientific progress and ambition in science, and the role in which scientific ambition without any real reflection can play. I think that was my biggest issue in this. I think it took a while for me to really grasp what point she was trying to get at, as far as like, what is it about scientific progress that is so bad? Why should we be fearing this? What is it about this, the way in which this is being done, that we're supposed to be worried about? Because progress for the sake of progress isn't necessarily bad. But I thought the book did a pretty good job. I honestly, when I read this the first time, in the years since, I've wondered, is this in my top 10 favorite books of all time? Which is something I'm constantly asking myself. And I've actually been wanting to reread a bunch of my older books that I think might be favorites. Because it's hard to say something's a favorite, like top 10 favorite, if you only read it once. And so I finally did reread it, and I did officially put it in my top 10 list on Goodreads. That might change, I don't know. But right now, I do feel like it deserves that, because it does a lot of what I love in a book, and especially when it comes to time travel. And I thought it was just really well executed personally. So a solid book that definitely stands up in my list of favorites. Now, like I said, on to the books that really don't stand up. Let's go on first to a book that I've reread. It's, I think, my third reread. That is Replay by Ken Grimwood. This also is a Groundhog's narrative where the man dies at like age 40 something and he wakes up in his like 18-year-old self. And it's a very superficial book. It explores similar ideas to that of Harry August, but I don't think it does so in a way that is quite as introspective as Harry August. It just feels more like a easy plot device that could easily be executed for a compelling narrative. It's very superficial in the sense that, sure, I'm a white man who considered what it would be like to wake up in my younger self, and there's a lot of things you could do. You could make money, you have more confidence and more understanding of how to get great sex. That's the center point of this narrative. But the problems, I think, are broader than that, which is when I think about how it treats female characters. There's one major woman character who inevitably ends up with him. I don't know. I don't like the idea that they necessarily need to be sexual, but it wasn't the worst part. I think there was just the commentary around women, also an underlying problem with a man who's reliving his lives, having sex. I didn't mention it in Harry August, but it also didn't feel as obvious there. But like this idea that you are decades to hundreds of years old, even though you give them the illusion of being a young man, a young teenager, doing that, getting sex under that impression feels misguiding, feels like there's an inherent power imbalance that is just inescapable there, that isn't explored and just feels kind of ooh. But then there's just the general conversation around women, especially when it comes to them reliving a life at one point where he's connected with this woman who's also reliving her life, and they're sexual, but then they wake up again in their younger selves, and he finds her when she's 14 or 15, and when they finally reconnect, he makes a comment about how he's kind of intrigued or excited by the idea of her being in a younger body, and she casually accepts that in a way that she's like, oh, I bet you do. And it just, that whole conversation just, first off, didn't feel real. I didn't see a woman actually saying that, but also just the inherent oohness to that and the sexualization of a child. It doesn't matter if she's mature, it's just that mindset that is just so casually inserted there that is just kind of like a glaring example of the problem with this book. That said, it's still a fun book. And if you like time travel, I do think it is a good book to give a try, because it is sort of foundational, especially to the Groundhog narrative, because from my understanding, I think it even preceded Groundhog's Day. And from that sense, it is unique. but it's still definitely aged poorly. That said, I mean, let's move on to books that I think do a worse job. Let's move on to Joe Alderman's The Accidental Time Machine. Like, when I read this, I liked it. I don't remember loving it as much as other books. Now I read it again, and God, this book is really not good. This book is about a young man who is a grad student who accidentally creates a machine that pushes him forward in time. It's basically The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, just from a modern perspective. And for what it's worth, I did find this book easier to read and more compelling than H.G. Wells's. But at the same time, the way in which he uses this time machine to explore futures feels sort of superficial. I don't think he does a good job of really contemplating what these futures might be like. And there's still a major problem around gender and its treatment of women. We have this man who always describes women by their looks. And when he gets into these futures, there's also this situation with bad power dynamic where because he's in the future, he's at a point where he's been remembered as recognized as making the time machine, and he's become like an honorary professorship. But then you go on far enough and religion has taken over. MIT, the school which he was working at, that he got his sort of honorary professorship, has now become like a religious place. And he gets a grad student who is an 18-year-old woman or girl who is naive about a lot of things, and she's a quote-unquote grad student in like a very abstract way of thinking about it. She's more like an assistant to a religious priest of a sort. And I should probably give a spoiler warning to this earlier on. There might be mild spoilers here. She ends up going in the future with him. While she's there, we're constantly seeing her sexualized by our main character here. He has this sort of nice guy perspective where he's saying, oh, I can't do this because I'm taking advantage of her, because it's true, he's in a power situation where he is technically her superior. But there's also like an inherent situation here where she's just inherently naive, almost childlike in the information she doesn't have because of the society she was forced to grow in. We reach a point where they do inevitably get together, but it's supposed to be framed as in a way that is, oh, she's fallen for him, that she likes him, she loves him, whatever. And first off, that relationship dynamic did not come together at all. It was not really built up at all. It was just completely forced. It was nonsensical why she would be in love with him just because she happened to be around him. There's also a feel of like, oh, the nice guy gets the girl because he's earned her for being a nice guy. And that's just the underlying feeling here that it's just kind of pushing a very bad idea that I'm, I guess, more conscientious of now than I was when I first read this like 4 or more years ago. But there's also other problems here where he's constantly talking about or thinking about her age. How old is she? She looks like she could be 16, 17. She finally says, oh, I'm 18. And he's like, oh, great. Oh, in my time, that is of age. That's all that really matters. It doesn't matter that he's considering or sexualizing someone he thinks is a child, but once he finds out, oh, she's 18, well, that just solves all the problems. There's no real conversation about why is there an age of consent and what does that mean? What is the underlying problems that come into that kind of power dynamic, and is that something that's resolved by her just being 18? Given the situation and everything that's piled on top of it, it absolutely is not. And this one is so bad. This is one that I can absolutely say it's not worth reading at all. It is a ripoff of The Time Machine. It feels like the epitome of white male privilege of succeeding on shit. You succeed on doing mediocre work, and that's what this is. It's really, like, the worst part about this is that I think the author probably thinks he's being woke. He's the kind of person who thinks, let me show you how progressive I am, in a way that is just so clearly trying to present itself as being forward thinking when it comes to women, when it's extremely shallow in its approach. It's honestly, when I look at this, I think to myself, how could I not have seen these problems when I first read this? It's honestly embarrassing. I don't recommend The Accidental Time Machine. I can't. Now let's go on to another one that I don't think was on my list. Actually, I guess it wasn't. It's Somewhere in Time by Richard Matheson. Was it on my list? Shit, I don't remember. Well, I'm talking about it now. This is a story about a man. Actually, let me give you a more modern day perspective. Imagine you have a man who is swiping on Tinder and comes across a picture of a woman that he just becomes enamored with. So enamored that he hunts her down on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, finds every information he can about her, then hunts her down. And once he finds her, he realizes she's clearly unsettled by whoever this guy is, but he keeps pursuing her. And because of magic, they end up together. Spoilers, there's a lot more to the story, but That's what's happening in this book. Like, except you don't have Tinder. You have a painting in a hotel this man sees. So he believes he can push himself through time. So that's a time travel part. Where he can imagine himself going through time. And to be fair, I don't have a problem with that. It's a speculative story about a man who has brain cancer. And I can accept that. It's just the fact that the underlying premise of this entire book is just fundamentally creepy. It's fundamentally creepy that you have this guy who is basically a stalker, even if it's time travel stalking, and he hunts on this woman. But the problem is that it's not just the premise that sets up the narrative, it's an ongoing problem, because there's this inherent need, this inherent desire, this inherent feel that he and her are meant to be together, that whatever it takes, he has to make it happen. And he manipulates and he lies to get to her when he inevitably time travels, at least in his head or otherwise. And even though he's constantly getting the impression, right or wrong, he gets the impression that she's uncomfortable multiple times, but he doesn't let up because of that. He is happy to pursue because he thinks he is just so right. And the fact that he is right doesn't make it any less of a problem. I guess I see that now. I had the problems I had before is that it is overly sentimental, but it's more than that. Like the problems when I first read it, I mean, there's a fundamental cringeness to this narrative that is just, I think it doesn't work. It can't work. There are multiple reviews who are saying this is clearly written by a man, and they're right. It is clearly written by a man, and it just doesn't work. It does not work. Now finally, one last book I want to talk about here. A book that I think is still worth reading, but it clearly reflects the author's sexism, and that is The End of Eternity by Isaac Asimov. This is one that I gave 5 stars at the time. I did really love this. I'm pretty sure I recommended this on my video, and I understand why. It's a very compelling story that is very reflective and imaginative. If you think of the time variant authority in Loki, that's what Eternity is here. This is a book about the time variant authority, and this preceded it, so I'm pretty sure this probably inspired that storyline, not of Loki in particular, but of the comics that inspired Loki. And naturally, that concept, there's just a lot to unpack there, and I think there is some really interesting shit that goes on in this book because of it. But there's a big aspect of this book that while we're exploring Eternity, or the time variant authority, there's a big plot that goes on in here, the underlying major plot of the story that is built on a relationship between the main character, the man, and a woman, and it's their interactions that it just fundamentally makes the story undercut. First off, Eternity, the time variant authority, has no women because the people in the authority all come from different universes, and there's something about taking women out of the universes that just is too damaging to that timeline. And in a way, it feels like Asimov is trying to say, oh, women are too important to take out, in a way that feels like he's trying to give them some type of respect or honor, even though it is sort of like putting on a pedestal. But instead, it feels like the type of women are important because they need to be like the mothers need to be in the kitchen. That's the impression that it sort of gave off, the way in which he went about it. But even then, I should say that there is some critique going on in here. I clearly see him trying to critique some of the patriarchal problems of the book, but it's not enough because it feels more like an excuse not to include women, much like in Foundation. When I read that, I really liked Foundation, but I realized this was a very sexist book. There were no women, and the only woman that was in there was just treated very poorly. It was very bad characterization for the women, and that was again in here. We have one woman. She is here as an object. She is here described as her looks, as something to be ascertained by our main character. And before he decides to pursue her, though, there's a series of microaggressions that he gives to her for daring to tempt him in the first place. Because, women aren't supposed to be here. And again, maybe there's some commentary that he's trying to have in here, but it's still just bogged down by not commentary, but just by problems that I think come from his perspective, from Asimov's perspective. And even if we ignore the patriarchy that is this society, this Eternity system, the relationship that is built between this main character and the woman does not feel natural. It feels very forced, and that undercuts the story on a fundamental level. I would probably give this 4 stars, even though I gave it 5 before, because it is still a very compelling book, but it it turns what could have been an amazing book into a good book because of the fact that he couldn't get past his own internal issues, which is sad, thinking of how progressive he was, which is, there's some commentary to be added. People like Asimov, I think, were considered to be pretty progressive, but clearly he was still a product of his time. And I had this discussion with some people that I work with earlier today, and one of them suggested these are good opportunities to admire, I guess, the good parts, but also reflect on the problems that reflect these individuals, I guess, upbringings in society, to paraphrase. That there's something to be ascertained, especially from people like Asimov, but it's important to recognize the ways in which he fed into a very dangerous mindset, which is the patriarchy. And I say this because these aren't books that I read for the first time. These are books that I reread within 2 or more years, and these are thoughts that did not cross my mind the first time, which I guess in one way it's like, what has changed? I think I do know what has changed, which I'll touch on in a second, but it still shows, I think, assuming I am reflective of society at large, it still, I think, shows a problem of these ideas being fairly pervasive. Like, not necessarily that I think this way or that way, other men do, but that I can so casually accept it without a second glance. And I think that is, while it is just me, obviously I'm talking about myself here, I do not think it's that big of a stretch to say that that is the problem, right, with society at large, with men at large, and the need, in the problem, the nature of the patriarchy, the system of oppression that exists, to mansplain to all of you, I guess, what the patriarchy is. Forgive me, please, I'm trying my best here. But that's what I'm trying to get at. What was my point? I don't remember. Oh yes, okay, so now as it relates to how have my feelings changed? I think there's a good reason for it. Booktube has made a difference. Not just Booktube, not just the existence of Booktube, but with individuals on Booktube that I follow, individuals who have changed the way in which I read, the way in which I think about what I'm reading. I am more of an in-depth reader than I used to be. There are questions I think to ask that I did not once ask because of people like in Jerry from Onyx Pages, who's always saying, read deliberately, read with purpose, and with intent. I try to do that, but it's hard to measure if that's happening. And I think when I look back on these not that long ago reads, and I see it very differently, I think it does show that our perspectives can be shaped and can be changed. So I think there's something to be said about that way of thinking that Jerry and others share. So I'm very grateful to you, and Jerry and others, for giving me the opportunity to learn and to grow. But that's enough about me. I wanted to do a time travel book series, again, not series, but a video for a while now. The problem is a lot of the time travel books I've read, I haven't loved as much as I did these originally, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to at least discuss the list that I've already put out there and to just reflect to see, do they really stand up? Now you see which ones do, which ones don't, in my opinion. Let me know if you've read any of these, and if you have, if you share any of my thoughts, or if you think you won't read them now, or if you will just for the sake of studying them, because I think there's something to be said, particularly of books that I think have more to them than just the sexism, which is to say Asimov. But otherwise, just, if you made it this far, why don't you give me a clock in the comments. And thank you so much for sticking around. This is kind of a long video, but it was fun talking about, and I hope you enjoyed it, and learn something, I guess, if I have anything substantive to say. But as always, have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see y'all next time, okay? Goodbye.